Thank you very much for joining us. So we have Christopher Schmidt, Head of Supply Network Operations for Europe, Middle East, Africa, and Russia for Merck.
Good morning.
Very nice to meet you. And we have Saulo Martiniano, Senior Vice President, Global Manufacturing of L'Oréal. We have Chris Cox, Global Head of Trade and Working Capital Solutions, Citi. And then we have our fourth speaker joining us virtually, Pete Mento, Head of Procurement and Commercial Excellence, International Supply Chain Wayfair. Thank you very much all for joining us. And without any further ado, let me start. But before I start, let me remind you that if you have any questions, please log them, and we will cover some of them hopefully at the end of the session. So we will first start with Saulo. And what I would like to ask you is, how did e-commerce impact manufacturing, and how do you think the manufacturing landscape has changed?
Thank you. Well, it has had a huge impact in manufacturing. And let me start with you with an example. An activation on TikTok can uplift demand, by tenfold. So how do you respond to that? Tenfold uplift demand with no anticipation. Lead times, to build factories, even to expand existing factories, are 18 to 24 months, are huge. Even lead times for raw ingredients and components in our industry, is very long. So how do you respond, to an uplifting demand when you have no visibility of that coming? So you've got to really prepare, and rethink our models in order to respond and to be able to be in capacity to respond to those uplift and those changes in the market. Mm-hmm. The traditional solution of inventory no longer valid. How can you have inventory that covers, all the portfolio and all the needs, the potential needs of the consumers? And the interesting is it can go both ways. You can also bet, a lot of on your products, and an activation or a social media, comment can, tank your demand. And so how do you respond to that? Again, inventory cannot be the solution. And the optimization via cost, which was, the mantra with a lot of supply chains in the past, have to be rethought. And a lot of investments have to go into capacity, responsiveness, agility to be able to be connected to the consumer and then be able to be in capacity to respond.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned responsiveness quite a few times. So what are the building blocks for you to create a responsive supply chain? You already mentioned capacity, so I'm assuming buffer capacity. What else do you think is critical?
Yeah, so capacity, and you have to think about capacity on the extended ecosystem. It cannot be, and we had recent examples where we were in capacity, internally to respond, but our suppliers, tier 1 and tier 2, would not be able to respond because they also operate on, a saturation model. The margins on the businesses are very different. So you really got to understand the full value, that is driven across the value chain, to be able to be prepared and be in capacity to respond, not only within your own manufacturing footprint, but with your suppliers as well. There's no point of having internal capacity if you can't really convert, that capacity into products. We saw, examples, I work for L'Oréal now, so examples, for example, during the pandemic, when all the salons, closed, and the demand, for hair coloration product went up fourfold. We were in capacity to respond internally, but our suppliers, and we found it on the hard way, were not in full capacity to matching our ability to respond. Mm-hmm. So we learned in a painful way, and we're taking the lessons to be better prepared.
Mm. And what steps do you take to ensure that your suppliers can move with you during these changes?
Yeah, when we talk about BCP, when we talk about readiness, when we talk about preparation, it's easily said than done, because when it comes to reality, you also have to be prepared to, bear the cost of those models. You have to be prepared to invest and to have insurance policies across your supply chain across your value chain to be able to respond, to those needs. And obviously, and I think this morning it was touched, it cannot be, this solution cannot be applied for every single part of your business. You have really to understand, the models. You have to understand the different value chains you got in your business to be able to have the appropriate solutions for them, because you're not going to be able to afford a one solution to all business models. So you have to be connected to your consumer. You have to be understanding what are, the main needs and what are the products that you will be in capacity to respond.
Mm-hmm. And for the other panel members, have you experienced the same thing? Has responsiveness become a little bit of a more important issue for your supply chains too?
So for us, if I may say, I'm working for the pharmaceutical industry.
Mm-hmm.
It is definitely a topic, but it's not getting easier because our lead times, probably as in L'Oréal, are very, very long, and this agility that we need in order to be more flexible, to cover patient demands, is kind of very complicated because our products are framed into a very complicated, I would say, regulatory framework, or dependent on a lot of guidelines that differ from country to country. There is the strong demand of being more agile, more flexible, but we must say that for us, for the pharmaceutical industry, governmental guidelines do not always support this kind of flexibility that we need, actually.
Yeah. Thank you. I want to move to you, Pete. First of all, thank you for joining us virtually. And I want to ask you, since COVID or during COVID, what have we learned on the consumer side? So what are some key learnings during COVID period, and how do you think it affects our thinking about manufacturing?
So I apologize if I'm a bit delayed on this end. Sorry if it's taking me a moment to get across. Some of the things we've learned from the COVID issues on the consumer end is that, first of all, shockingly, how quickly people moved towards this model of e-commerce. Their desire to have practically anything delivered. I work for a large furniture company, and the fact that people were more than willing to have everything from love seats to major parts of their homes, kitchens, parts of their bathrooms simply delivered without seeing it in person could be a bit of a shock. That most of us are now very comfortable having our groceries delivered on a daily basis. Having anything practically delivered came as a bit of a shock to us, how quickly it had been adopted. So it took something like COVID to have us accelerate the e-commerce part of our lives. It was an interesting laboratory for that to happen. Also, the fact that we had to completely change so much of our infrastructure logistically. The Western infrastructure for logistics was not necessarily ready for the stopping of what happened with COVID and then its complete restart, and all of the infrastructure that was necessary to support this adoption of e-commerce, from small package all the way through the containerization of what's happening, the adoption of de minimis around the world to avoid tariffs as well. We were just not quite ready for so many people to adopt the use of e-commerce and walk away from traditional large order retail and all the things that come from it. So I think one of the great learnings that we've taken from this is just the larger economic models that we'd all grown used to, particularly in the past, let's say 30 years, are all being radically changed. Trying to get comfortable with this idea of dealing with distribution directly from Asia, getting radically used to this idea of how consumers simply don't need to go to retailers anymore to buy things. It's happened a lot quicker than I think anybody was ready to imagine.
And of course, e-commerce, especially in some of the sectors, has been raising exponentially in the last couple of decades. But then we have this huge explosion that we have never witnessed before. What do you think will happen now? Do you think consumers will stick more to online shopping, or there seem to be different pressures? There's also some pressure for local consumption, local production. There is some trade-related concerns. So where do you think it's going to go now?
I think we'll see the next evolution. I think you're going to see a combination of growth. You know, you're going to see more people going into stores, taking a look at what they want, and then having it fulfilled through e-commerce, being able to see something that they want and doing this buy online, pick up in store. You're also going to have more people who are embracing e-commerce globally. Remember, it's still a relatively larger economy concept. And I think it's only going to grow and get perfected. We're still in the early days. We're still in the early days of how we fulfill e-commerce. I think the purchase side of it is getting more and more perfected. And I think that the ideas of how we actually pay for it, just the whole platform is getting better. But it's really a supply chain question. E-commerce is very little more than just a very well perfected supply chain when you get right down to it. And how we manage that is what's being perfected. And that's really going to be in the hands of the people working on it today. So I think the fulfillment of it is where that next evolution is. And that's going to come down to the consumer themselves telling us exactly how they want to be served in this marketplace.
I think also, it's going to evolve, putting a lot of pressure on supply chains and companies to operate even more efficiently. We talk about flexibility is important, but I think also, the efficiency part of it is not going to be, taken away. Just think about today, and I use examples of my family. They go into shop, they like a product, they immediately go online. They check prices, from whatever is available, in the web, in the e-commerce platforms, and that has put a lot of power in the hands of the consumers. So in order for the companies to maintain, to be able to operate with the margins that they're used to, they're going to have to drive a lot of efficiency across the value chain, and that's going to, that's here to stay. That's not going to go away.
Yes, both of you have mentioned omni-channels. The customer really going to different entities, whether online or in store, during different parts of the purchasing process. And both of you see this increasing. Do you think that will change how we think about our supply chains, about our supply networks? Will we need to have some adjustments to be able to cope and have the customer seamlessly switch between these different entities? Pete.
I can't believe this, but the fire alarm just went off in my office. So I'm going to have to take off. I apologize.
Wait further instructions.
He's got a fire alarm. He needs to leave.
Oh, it's the fire.
Not ours, it is.
I thought we just had a new panelist join us. What do you think? So with omni-channel, do you think it will require us to rethink supply chains a little bit to deal with it?
I think so, to some extent. I think the companies will have to be prepared, to fulfill the demand, on a different way that they used to. So trying to think of an example, if you get your consumers, on a brick and mortar store now, and they like a product, they're going to expect, that product to be delivered within a certain time frame. And how do you, position your inventory, position your products, and be again back to the theme of being closer in understanding, what are the hero products that you're going to do it in this way is going to be the challenge for the companies, and the ones who excel that in a better way will be the winners, in my opinion.
Yes, you're right. Now, we talked about the product flow. We talked a little bit about the customer demands. Now we're going to go to a completely different sector and talk about healthcare. And of course, the patient pathway, the healthcare sector, there's a big push from regulations from different countries on digitization. So what are your thoughts on how e-commerce is going to affect healthcare?
Yeah, it's. I think our industry, first of all, is very much different to fast-moving consumer goods. We don't speak about the customer in this sense. We speak about the patient. We as pharmaceutical companies are as well not in the position to sell directly to patients. That's usually what the regulatory framework would tell us that we have to go through pharmacies, that we have to go through wholesalers and distributors. Nevertheless, we do these kind of things in this kind of traditional way of selling products together with our pharmacies and with our distributors. And I think the pandemic has accelerated this pathway. I mean, when there have been thoughts a couple of years ago about how do we improve e-commerce, how do we get more efficient, how do we get faster, how do we improve inventory situations for everyone along this pathway or along the supply chain, the pandemic definitely has opened our eyes 2 years ago when suddenly all of us became supply chainers. Because we just didn't go to the supermarket and bought toilet paper because we thought we needed it. But as well, a lot of us who have medical conditions went to their nearest pharmacy and bought cardiometabolic, diabetes, and whatsoever products because they thought something is going to happen. We don't know yet what's going to happen. And the governments as well in all of the countries, not just here in Europe, in Britain, in the European Union, but all over the world, they started to not know what's going to happen with the pandemic and what actually this is going to cause for the health system and how are we going to combat this disease. So they started stockpiling. And then we as a pharmaceutical manufacturer, we said it's going to be very, very difficult to bring certain products into certain countries that are needed if, first of all, we don't have the regulatory approval, but the government says we need this product. And then we very easily found out how do we measure our demand. We actually even did not know what do you need in country A and B and C for drug A, B, and C. So this, at least on a European level here in the European Union, but as well in the US, together with the FDA, has triggered a discussion about how can we make demand more transparent? How can we get forecasts that enable us to prepare for manufacturing activities and that we are enabling ourselves to bring products to the patients? Nevertheless, I must say, since our industry is here probably a little bit more traditional, we are struggling a little bit with this direct-to-patient access. It is, through this regulatory framework, very difficult. We usually cannot do this. We tried with pharmacies to implement things like we want to deliver products directly to a patient. But very often, it's for us as a manufacturer, it's not possible. We have to do it through pharmacies. And here we are trying to make it more e-commerce able each and every day, because the times of using a telefax or an email to purchase your drugs, I guess it's over for every one of us. I wish it would be that easy, like for other fast consumer goods, where you just go into an app and you click, and in 15 minutes somebody knocks the door and says, here's your product. For us, unfortunately, it will not be possible. On the medical side, probably it's as well good that it's not that easy to get drugs without having spoken to a healthcare practitioner before.
Mm. And how do you think you are going to move forward?
We are in discussions together with the industry. We speak about these things. How can we guarantee that the regulatory body like EMA is helping us, for all of us in the manufacturing industry for pharmaceutical products, to get more transparency on data? They have to help us to get systems, to really set up systems that allow us to see where is the demand happening in which countries, and at the same time to give us the possibility, the legal possibility, to have a product shipped to a country where it's not registered. I give you one example. Since this is as well under my responsibility, the Ukraine and Russia war has triggered a complete different scenario now as well, with millions of people fleeing a country into a neighboring country, for instance, into Poland, but they need their medicines, right? And they probably will not be able to get their medicines because of a prescription, because it's not registered, or because simply they cannot read what says the leaflet. Mm-hmm. So together with EMA, the European body, or the European medicine agencies, we're discussing these possibilities of how can we give access to Ukrainian patients in Poland by using a Polish product. That means we have to find a complete different way that this Polish package is getting translated, that there is an app, that there is a barcode where you can scan it. It doesn't prevent you from going to a pharmacy to buy it, what you then probably would call kind of a commerce topic, but it gets into E. It does not get into commerce yet, but it gets into E in order to enable patients to get their product, even in a country where they are not able to usually read and speak the language.
And you mentioned the importance of transparency, demand transparency. One of the challenges seems that the supply chain structures is very different from country to country, and the technological maturity actually down towards downstream, towards the pharmacies, is very different. Italy is a very different scenario than England, which is also a very different scenario from Ireland, which is our neighbor. So how do you deal with that complexity?
It is a very complex topic. We usually don't do it alone because we don't have usually this kind of experience. I mean, we are producing drugs. We're usually not doing the distribution, the secondary distribution, so we need partners here. We need global partners that have this experience. We usually try to work with the best. One of the topics that recently I think affect all of us is really the inflation topic and the cost pressure. It gets more and more complicated every day to have a cost-efficient way to deliver drugs to the patients and to our customers. It's an ongoing discussion. The transparency part is, I still see it a little bit far away. It depends as well from country to country. In some countries, you pretty much know what's going on from the demand perspective, so you can plan better. In some countries, you can plan less. It gets even more complicated if the government tells you this is the demand, and you have to cover the demand by, for instance, stockpiling. They tell us you have to have 3 months of inventory sitting somewhere, and this is the demand, even though we're telling them this is not the demand. This is because you're telling us that we have to have it there, and it costs a lot of money, and it's not helping. It's still a long way to go, I would say.
Okay.
And I would complement, and I've been reflecting about this topic on data transparency, and I think it's actually preventing a lot of further collaboration and further optimization of full end-to-end value chains. As we've seen different levels of protectionism about the data. People still trying to figure out how they can monetize, the information that they have. So they would not collaborate and they would not share, transparently, the data across what's happening on the demand throughout the different tiers in the value chain. And I think that's a huge blocker, to further optimize. And I think we're just at the start. Things will have to evolve because I cannot imagine the days that we have today that we cannot really connect, all nodes of a supply chain and still be operating with forecast mode, completely disconnecting, which doesn't make sense. But my reflection is this is coming from the ambition of some companies to monetize the information that they have acquired, and I think things will evolve so the information can flow more transparently across the different levels.
Yes, and at that point, of course, it's not only the technology, but it's also the relationships that become fundamentally important, how much you trust each other and how much you feel the relationships are fair, right? So it becomes quite a challenge. Now, we should switch to money, which is the last part we haven't talked about yet, and supply chain finance. So what are the evolving dynamics around the world with shifts in supply chain finance? Where do you see it going? How does it complement the flow of information and products?
Thank you. Look, fascinating to hear from corporate clients dealing with consumers. The provision of finance to people is slightly different. If we look at supply chains, they've been incredibly stressed. First, it was people going home from COVID, and it was extending the financing terms, and it was responding to higher credit spreads. Then the governments injected the financial impulse that they did. People went back to work. There was huge demand for goods that we've covered, and then it's been the provision of additional finance. But the reality is supply chains are incredibly stretched. We published a recent report, the City GPS report is available publicly. We publish a pressure index in that is close to all-time highs. And the sad reality is, given the events in Russia and Ukraine, just when we thought things were getting better, they've actually taken a turn for the worst. You talked about transparency in supply chains. You now just don't have a transparency challenge, you also have the challenge of a raft of regulation that is going to require massive reconfiguration of supply chains globally. If you look at energy, the numbers are well understood in Europe. The topic of food security is coming to the fore, but it extends further into not just primary goods, metals and things like that, but it also falls into intermediate goods and even simple things like supplies of gas products necessary for semiconductor manufacture. So supply chain as an issue certainly will not be out of the headline, and we don't see it getting better anytime soon. And from a client perspective, we see people really focused on the topics that are raised. Supply chain transparency. What is the status of my supplier? Can they supply my goods? Can they supply them on time? Supply chain redesign. If my supplier can't supply me, if my supplier is prohibited from supplying me, how do I redesign my supply chain? Then there's logistics and optimization. A year or so ago, we were talking about ships queuing off the west coast of the United States. That situation's got better, but it hasn't gone away. And then, of course, we as financiers, as well as our clients, we have to comply with the raft of regulation that has just come down and be sure about the source of supply and whom we're financing. So from a finance perspective, it's really not as simple as the relationship with a consumer. COVID certainly accelerated a number of different trends. You can pick obvious examples. You talked about the fragmentation of trade. Trade, I think, is the second largest asset class globally. It's one of the oldest banking activities, but its design also reflects that. It's incredibly paper-based. So COVID's really encouraged us to adopt new practices, simple things like OCR, so the dematerialization of documents so we can process them faster, e-signing of documents. Until a few years ago, an awful lot of documents in trade had to be signed with wet ink. There's no good reason for it. We've adopted those technologies. Risk and compliance screening. We rolled out next generation risk and compliance screening at Citi. It's hugely increased the scalability and our confidence in our capacity to screen the finance activities that we carry out. And then, of course, when it comes to supply chain, the digitization of supplier onboarding, how quickly we can respond to our corporate's requirements to onboard clients. But the reality of trade, and I've touched on it, is it is fragmented. It's fragmented by geography, it's fragmented by regulation, and it's fragmented by participants, and you talk to this. If you can compare and contrast the cloud computing industry, which was designed for digital, with trade, if you look at cloud computing, the number one provider has a 32% market share, and the top 5 have 69%. The comparison stat for trade is the largest provider has a less than 5% share, and the top 5 have less than 16% share. So there is a real lack of standards. There is some good news. We do see 4 themes emerging. Focus on data standards as an enabler of efficiency. We see some regulatory initiatives heading this way. In the UK, there's some work on I think it's e-bills of lading. Out of Singapore and India, there is work on digitization of invoice standards. Right? If you take something as simple as fraud within trade, just for banks to be able to have a single golden record of truth, avoid dual lending, is a huge enabler. We also see platforms emerging, right? Marketplace solutions bringing together buyers, suppliers, and financiers. We think that is a very healthy thing. Our own supply chain platform is genuinely multi-party. I'll give you some numbers on that shortly. But firms like Taulia, Demica, LiquidX are all going the same way. They want to make liquidity. They want to make the connection between buyers and sellers much stronger. I've touched on it. If you like, finance to business not being the same as business to consumer, that's very much the case. If you think about financing, it's a regulated industry. We're distributing regulated services. So the act of digitizing, know your customer, understand the trade, process the financing requirement, authorize the financing requirement, make the disbursement, and then maintain that through the life cycle. That is a complicated life cycle to digitize and maintain regulatory compliance. So we think we're into the second phase of digitalization in finance. We do think there is a lot of learning still to be taken on board. You asked also about sustainability. I think there are 2 dimensions to sustainability. There is the constant provision of access to finance. Companies need working capital, and we need to be there. It's easy to be there in good days. It's much harder to be there in really stressed periods when credit markets are challenging. I mentioned a moment ago about Citi's supply chain financing platform. I'm proud that the team put through $250 billion worth of financing last year. You know, we support 100,000 suppliers. We onboard 10,000 suppliers a year. So we've extensively digitized and scaled, and that capability has stood up through the periods of stress that we've witnessed. And we can continuing to see really strong demand for that from people. So even this year, we're seeing double-digit growth rates. And sustainability is there in terms of availability of finance and performance on platform. And then the second dimension, obviously, of sustainability is the ESG piece of it. And that's where we're working with our clients, and we're introducing screening services like EcoVadis, where we quantitatively look at supply chain sustainability metrics front to back, so we can work with our partners, not just to deliver them the financing, but deliver sustainability improvements in terms of their ESG performance and obviously Citi's ESG performance.
Thank you very much. Sustainability, of course, is a huge topic, and I would love to go more into it, but I feel there are wonderful questions. We are not going to be able to go through all of them, and I apologize upfront, but we should start because there are some really good ones. The first one, since we have your back, Pete, I would like to ask you, and that is, what is your perspective on the ability to pass on cost increases to customers over the next 1-2 years?
Cost increases because of transportation, I imagine, and inflation.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's it's like anything else. The market is going to do what the market's going to do. With regards to logistics and all the rest of it, companies are going to have to make decisions about profit. So companies like steamship lines, as an example, your freight forwarders of the world, they've enjoyed record profits over the course of the past 3 years. I'm very fortunate. We've never seen, in my career at least, the sort of profits that we've seen for freight forwarders, ocean carriers, air carriers, customs house brokers, and they're going to have to take a haircut. It's just not sustainable. Since the reopening of China over the course of the past few weeks, we've seen some softening in the ocean spot market, and that's probably it's going to be followed by some canceling of sailings, so that these carriers and can try to maintain some of that shareholder value for their ocean carriers. And it's unfortunate, but we can't have those good times last forever for them, right? So that's just the reality of things. You're never going to see these incredibly low that we saw before, $1,500, $1,000, 40-foot ocean containers from Asia. You're going to see the $1,000 range somewhere in there. But that's just because they've realized the discipline that they can have by working in those units together. And that's just the way it's going to be going forward. And you're going to see that passed on to consumers. The other side of that as well is I think that transportation and logistics technology is giving more visibility to transportation providers. And that's going to give them more discipline as well on how they bill. But that's a double-edged sword. Large transportation consumers, like large beneficial cargo, very large consumers of transportation, are going to be able to use that technology as well to better buy and to better consume logistics and to do it in a more meaningful way and control those costs.
Thank you very much. So your point essentially is that the costs are going to be passed on to consumers in some sectors. In some, I'm sure that's going to be less of a choice. And in some, we will try to get more efficient with the use of technologies. One of the other questions here that I think is quite relevant, especially nowadays, is how are we going to deal with the coming disruptions? We are going through a really disrupted period. Just when we got out of COVID, of course, Ukraine happened. A lot of economies are looking at recessions potentially. So where do you think this will take us from the supply chain perspective? Any of you, would you like to?
If I may, I think we have to get even more innovative when it comes to supply chains, because we have to find our ways to the customer, to the patients, right? In our particular case, if one border closes, we try to find another entry point where we can go and enter. If in the past we were using a container boat to ship our products to, I don't know, Saudi Arabia, and tomorrow we cannot do this for whatever reason because the Suez Canal is closed, we will have to take an airplane. If there is no airplane, we will have to use a truck, and we have done these kind of things. We, in particular, we have recently even started to experiment with a train from Germany to China, just to put our products onto a train, and it worked. It took much longer. It was much more complicated because you had to cross like XYZ frontiers. But I think we supply chainers, we always find a solution. It might not be the most cost-effective one, but in the end, we find a solution. And if I may say this as a last point, as a consumer myself, because you were asking about the price increases. I mean, there's one positive thing about COVID where we are able to ask for whatever product via an app. It's easy, right? Somebody knocks the door, drops the box, but we don't pay it yet, right? So there is discussions. I know that there is discussions from freight forwarders, at least like DHL or FedEx, that say this is not our business model. This was not our business model to bring everything for free. So we will have to increase our charges to the Amazons, to the Alibabas, and whatsoever. And I think this is going to come for all of us, that we will, at one point in time, will have to pay a little bit more of the share that the freight forwarders are paying. And at the same time, we all want to be sustainable. But I don't know, I'm questioning sometimes if we are really sustainable, if everybody of us just asks products by an app rather than going to a store like we were used to go. There will be challenges, but we supply chainers will always find a way to get products to our customers.
You're right, and it seems like, of course, we find a lot of immediate solutions, but part of the challenge is finding long-term solutions because some of these seem structural problems that are not going to go away and come our way one way or another. So I would like to thank all of you before we finish, but do you have any final comments you would like to share with us?
Maybe I will, put, a final comment, which is, for me, a very important topic, which is the supply chain talent. We've seen, the complexity and the level, the degree of freedom that we used to have for operate is getting, less and less available. To your point, Chris, you're saying we'll find a way, but, the pressures, sustainability, cost, efficiency, timelines, it's here to stay. And if we don't, take a strategic view on developing and almost recuperating the glamour of being in supply chain, we are in the risk of being short. A lot of tech companies, a lot of other industries are using and are taking the supply chain talent and taking the talent available. And I think we have to bring back the glamour and the proudness of being in supply chain. And this is something we all as leaders we have to be mindful and be working actively on it.
Yes. And as a business school, of course, that's music to our ears, right? Thank you very much all for joining us. Please stay around for the next session. And I would like to thank all of our panelists. I know that there are so many more questions that we didn't get to. I hope you catch them and can ask them personally. And at this point, I would like to invite the moderator for the next session, Sangeeta Khurana. And thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Morning, everyone. Sangeeta Khurana, Professor for Economics. Thank you so much. Welcome to this session. And before I begin, let me start off by inviting my fellow panelists. This panel is on why incorporating ESG into supply chain finance could yield better returns. Let me start off by introducing my fellow panelists. First up, Mike Clark. He's a Vice President, Finance Strategy and Transformation, Coca-Cola Euro-Pacific Partner. Welcome, Mike. I would now like to welcome Anne Tracy, Chief Sustainability Officer for Colgate-Palmolive. A very warm welcome to you, Anne. The next person I would like to welcome is Ivan. He is the Chief Financial Officer, Vice President Finance, Procurement and Real Estate for Swatch Group. A very warm welcome to you. And last but not the least, very important, Heather. Heather Crawley is Global Head of Supply Chain Finance at JP Morgan Chase. Thank you so much, and a very warm welcome to you and to all other panelists. Let me start off by quickly introducing what this session is all about. To begin with, this is an incredible panel, and I will come to the floor with questions. Time is tight, and I will just take a minute, and we will then head off directly into the panel discussion. Now, by way of introduction, I would like to say that trade finance market is undergoing a radical transformation in terms of ESG, and which is why we decided to come up with this panel, which is highly topical. But the issue is merely addressing ESG objectives and being a so-called a good citizen does not necessarily translate into better business profitability. So companies need to transform their business purpose, their corporate strategy, and their operating model to evolve the business into long-term market opportunities through addressing the social needs. Well, let's get started with the first question. And I would like to start off with Mike, if I may. Mike, if I could ask you, how do you embed sustainability into your key decision-making processes?
Hello, everyone. I think that's a really good question because it's something that I think most organisations are struggling with, in that we have a lot of history of managing the business and managing the performance of the business, but managing different metrics. But managing the ESG metrics specifically is kind of a new thing to do. And I think it comes down to figuring out where it is that those key points of intervention are. When do those key decisions get made? So if you look at sort of reducing your carbon footprint or something like that, or greenhouse gas emissions, it comes down to, what are the CapEx decisions you're making? So if you can get an intervention into your CapEx process that makes sure that you are looking at sustainability metrics in the same way you're looking at payback and other manufacturing metrics. If you look at your budgeting, whether it be your long-range plan, whether it be your forecasts, if you're looking at your mix of your products and how that's affecting, then you've got clarity on those decisions and where those are. And I think the finance departments especially have a huge opportunity here, because often we're the guardians of those processes. We're the guardians of when the CapEx decisions get made, or where the annual planning processes. And so being able to take a broader agenda with those metrics, I think, is really important.
Thank you. Very interesting. Anne, I would like to ask you, how is it that your company embeds ESG into the supply chain? Because you are a massive company, so could you just elaborate on that?
Yeah, so, and I'm the lone man out here because I'm coming from the supply chain side, but I'm really pleased to hear Mike talk that way as a finance person and how we make decisions in the supply chain. It's great to hear. So I want to share a little bit about, we're also a consumer goods manufacturer. So as such, we've been on the ESG journey for quite some time, for over 20 years. So I want to frame kind of what I want to share with you kind of in yesterday, today, and tomorrow. So yes, we've been on this 20 years. We've been measuring, in fact, our greenhouse gas emissions for 20 years, and we've made
steep reductions in our own operations, so scope 1 and 2. And fast forward to today, and we develop strategies in 5-year increments. And one of my responsibilities was to develop both what we call our supply chain reimagined strategy for 2025 and our sustainability and social impact strategy for 2025. And now I'm focused on ESG and making sure that we really do keep it not just embedded in the supply chain, but across the whole company in all functions. And as I said, we've been at this for a long time. The supply chain was a leader in embedding ESG, mostly on the environmental and social side. So our current strategy has 3 ambition pillars: driving social impact, helping millions of homes, and preserving our environment. The social impact is about our own employees and the communities where we live and work, and ensuring that we have diversity in our innovation. Helping millions of homes is about our designing more sustainable products and embedding or helping people live more sustainably at home with those products. Now, preserving our environment is really where the supply chain plays a key role. So it's about the circular economy, eliminating plastic waste, zero waste in our facilities, responsible sourcing, conserving water, and very importantly, accelerating action on climate change. As I am working more and more closely, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, with our finance teams. That's why I'm glad to hear Mike talk that way, because they play such a key role in helping us now understand the value, not just of the risks, which we're working on, but also the opportunities that brings.
Thank you. Very interesting. And as I understand, you mentioned that the strategy is built along 3 pillars. So let me ask you, Yvonne, what about Swatch Group? How have they gone about designing their ESG standards and adopting them?
So what's interesting is that, as Anne, we've been on this journey since a very long time, at least 30 years, and we also work a lot in this scope 1 and scope 2 items for all of these years. 1 year and a half ago, there was a votation in Switzerland. We are very lucky. The people can help to take decisions also in the way the Swiss country works. And there was a votation about responsible business initiatives, where basically companies could be liable for any problems incurred all over the world, but liable in Switzerland as far as sustainable issues or a social issue would be concerned. Unluckily, this votation was refused by the population by a very small majority, but the Swiss Parliament decided to implement quite demanding reporting standards 1 year ago for quoted companies and banks and insurance and this kind of big companies which have a very big impact on population. And so we started really to make this reporting. We made it the first one this year, like every quoted company in Switzerland. And so, which is, of course, there is not this kind of issue of liability, not yet. We believe it's going to come anyway, but at least this reporting standards which we got, which all companies get all across the board, have a very big impact on us, but also on our suppliers. Switzerland is a country where a middle-sized company represents, roughly speaking, 70% of the value added. So when we work with our suppliers, of course, it's a very big issue we have to address, and we also started to address this issue a long time ago. But it's really positive, and people in Switzerland are, generally speaking, very sensitive about all of this issue about sustainability, definitely.
Yes, I agree. This is a trend which is fast catching on.
Yeah.
But I really wonder, how has COVID and the ugly head of inflationary pressure that is rising, geopolitical stress, how has that impacted? So let me pose this question to you, Heather. What is your opinion about these 3 factors? Have they in any ways or shape impacted on your business and on your thinking?
Well, certainly the demand for ESG-tied supply chain finance solutions has not diminished at all. It still continues to be very strong in the industry. And ESG is the future, and we need to continue to invest in it. I would say that the economic environment that our corporate clients, whether it be in the procurement or the CFO or any member of the C-suite, as they're navigating today's economic environment, from a JP Morgan perspective, we have to be acutely aware of what it takes to really manage an organization in today's financial environment. So we know that our clients are facing inflation, some credit risk, some displacement. And if we think about it, the commodity shock we have today is highly impactful. We haven't seen anything like this probably since the 1970s. So when you think about, for example, I have clients today, especially if they import energy or food, all of our clients, whether they're on the stage today or in the audience, you're acutely aware of the impact of those imports and the cost to your business on an everyday basis. So you couple that with the geopolitical risk that we have, and it really underscores the need to get liquidity to your complete supply chain, from the large suppliers to the small. It's no longer about, 20% of the suppliers or 80% of the finance, and I really need to care for those. Anyone around here knows that it just takes one item on that production line to not be available for that large MNC, and it's done, right? So that underscores the need for a product like supply chain finance that's really all about providing liquidity and financial stability to the suppliers all around. So a product like supply chain finance, it's really going to get payment to those suppliers at a great rate based on the buyer's rating, is fundamental to get through today's environment or the next environment or the next crisis that may come up. So based on the need for, in addition, we know the MNCs are signing up for ESG goals, right? So, or ESG targets. And in order to attain those targets, suppliers need to take action. Whether it means behaving differently, reporting differently, the MNCs have to achieve those goals. So it's a great combination, really, to naturally evolve a supply chain finance program from standard supply chain finance to add ESG, because the buyer needs the supplier needs the buyer, so the supplier can take those actions to meet the corporate's goals and also get that liquidity to them. So based on those two factors, the need to get liquidity to all the suppliers in a buyer's supply chain, as well as the ESG goals that corporates are signing up for, we will continue to see a strong push for SCF ESG solutions going forward. I really do not see that going away, nor the demand decreasing due to the environment we're in today.
Thank you. Very interesting. And it's good to hear that you see that the demand is going to increase. But however, I have a concern, and the concern is around standards. Because we know common standards unite. But sadly, within the context of ESG, we do not have any common standards. I haven't seen any yet, any of these standards evolve, unlike in accounting practices, to give you an example. So my question is, why is it difficult to agree on common standards? And I think can I ask you, Ivan, to...
Why, to develop on this?
Yes, that would be nice.
Yeah. Okay. So in the watch industry, Swiss watch industry, we have a standard in a way, a start of a standard, which is the Swiss-made standard. You heard all of you about it. So basically, we are lucky. It's a standard where we say basically that the value added on the watch has been for a certain percentage, which is 60% of the value added of the watch has been produced in Switzerland. So we started from this. It's a standard which dates back to, if I remember, 1974 or 1975. And based on this, it forces us basically to produce and to verticalize the production in Switzerland. And it's what we did now. Our CEOs have been very visionary in this sense, that so that we have a very much verticalized industrial supply chain in working with many technologies, be it in micro components, electronic components, up to any parts you can find in the watch, in the watches. But it helps really the industry to have this kind of ESG standards in a way. You know, it was as a consequence of this Swiss-made directive to create this kind of standards. And in addition, we have other kind of standards in the industry, which other industry have also, which are the REACH standards, for instance, on chemical components, or ROHS standards, so for instance, as far as lead is concerned, and all of these concerns us a lot. And we believe that these basic standards also help us, even if these are technical standards, to respond to this kind of standards we would lack today in the ESG environment. In addition, in Switzerland, the Swiss government, as I said, the Swiss population is very sensitive about this issue of sustainability. We have the way, as far as, for instance, energy consumption is concerned. So we made, as many other companies in Switzerland also, some agreements with some organizations in Switzerland, depending on the Swiss governments, to decrease our energy consumptions for gas and oil, etc. It's a plan on 10 years when we get credits, tax credits on this energy decrease consumption. So, yeah, I think, unluckily, there are no standards, as you said, similar to the finance standards which we can find right now. But something already exists which bring us on the right way to be able to respond to these ESG standards. Yes.
Thank you. Very interesting. So I think let's go back to the finance person here. Mike, you lead on financial strategy and transformation. So my question is, would you say consistent approach or rules across countries are important in the current economic climate? Well, I go back again to the point, because inflation is biting each one of us. Do you think, what is your perspective as the financial strategy expert here?
I wouldn't say I'm an expert. I'd say Van is as well qualified on finance as I am. I think if you look at the inflationary environment that we find ourselves in, it's both a blessing and a curse in terms of, sustainability. On the one hand, high oil prices make the payback on any environmental investment to reduce power usage a lot better. So the payback on putting solar panels in, the payback on reducing your power usage is just better now than it was 12 or 24 months ago. So on that perspective, actually it helps the ESG agenda. On the flip side, inflationary pressures mean that you need to pass pricing on. That's a challenge for many businesses, many industries, and that means that potentially there's less money about and less money to invest in inverted commas, discretionary projects, and ESG often comes into those. So I think there's a sort of pluses and minuses in the current environment as to being able to move forward. Certainly, I think, having simple metrics that everybody understands and are easy to measure has got to be a way forward. At the moment, there's a lot of different certifications you can get, a lot of different indices you can be in, and often the metrics are quite different. Undoubtedly that takes cost and it takes effort, and somewhere along the way that's effort that could be put into actually doing things that reduce greenhouse gas emissions or reduce water usage.
Interesting. And if I may ask you, what will it take to achieve common standards for the integration of ESG factors into the investment decision-making process?
Yeah, so I'm glad you came back to that. And it was interesting listening to Yvonne and highlighting, because it's a Swiss-based company, the Swiss standards, and part of the challenges that we face across the ESG community is different taxonomies and frameworks all over the world. We're a global company like Coca-Cola. So, and let's focus on climate. At least science-based targets is the one North Star we have that does kind of level the playing field. But beyond that, it is challenging because the expectations, and you may have heard, we're a U.S.-based company, so we turn to U.S.-based concerns that the SEC, which is what we have to adhere to financially, has now a proposal which will no doubt become reality to disclose climate-related impacts on your company. And so if you want to focus on climate, what they're going to be asking for is that companies assess and monetize both the risks and opportunities, much like if you've heard of TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. So, but that may not be exactly what is going to come out of the EU Green Deal, or even the UK for that matter. Mm-hmm. So that's the challenge with the lack of standards. But there are bigger boards out there, commissioned by the ISFR and ISSB that are working together. They recognize the challenge and they're trying to bring together some commonality across this space. But particularly in the case of Colgate, coming back to home, this is a long-term problem. Inflation, we all know, and I think earlier panels talked about volatility is here to stay. We get that. But the climate risk is a long-term issue. So we have to keep our eye on the long term, whether it's incentives or how we look at our financial practices. So again, going back to the yesterday, today, and tomorrow, yesterday, we've been investing. We have a policy in place for the past 10 years to invest at least 5% of our capital into projects that improve the planet, like solar power, water reduction, energy reduction.
So that's more like an incentive you provide, right?
Right. And then, yes. And then what we do know, though, is because we have a net zero carbon target for 2040, there's technology that doesn't exist yet.
Exactly.
So we're actually working with Coca-Cola and Unilever and AB InBev on a program called 100 Plus Accelerator that is infusing and incubating startups that tackle issues and come up with technology that doesn't exist today. Carbon cap, it's across all areas. It's circular economy, biodiversity, carbon capture. So
technology is the buzzword.
We have to invest in the future as well.
Yeah.
And that's a positive thing.
Yes.
To reduce the risk.
Yes, very interesting, because this is, so climate change is an issue that's, as we all know, is becoming increasingly important, very topical, and especially the technologies that are being invested in to address climate change problems is really at the forefront. Last week we were at Chogum and in Rwanda, and there was a full session devoted to clean technology and what could countries do to actually reach the zero mark, the zero mark. Let me move on to Anne. Thank you so much. Let me ask Anne, what do you...
Heather.
Right. No, it's Heather.
Yes.
What challenges do you see within the context of supply chain finance from the perspective of JP Morgan? I mean, we've discussed about climate change, other aspects, inflation, volatility. I'm sure these have an impact. These are factored in, and these are important challenges within the context of JP Morgan as well, supply chain.
Correct. I would say, one of the challenges we have in supply chain finance is actually similar to one of the benefits we talked about, right? Is you can incent suppliers to change their behavior to meet an ESG goal, right? So you can have financial incentives to incent them to change their behavior, whether it be their actions, their reporting, et cetera. But on that same front, it can also be a bit of a con in that you then have to prove and track that. And it's not always easy to do so. And whenever you have any level of vagueness, the audience, whether it be investors, regulators, consumers, may get a little bit cynical in terms of whenever you tie a financial incentive, so you're putting that structure together, and you need to ensure that you're showing that there's ESG behavior, positive ESG behavior associated with that financial benefit. Nobody wants to be accused of greenwashing. So from a JP Morgan perspective, when we sit down in front of clients and we want to put this together, we really want to future-proof those programs. I think we've talked about ESG is in a very volatile time. It's maturing. We want to ensure the programs we put in place today for our corporate clients will still be future-proofed for the future. So one thing that we do talk to clients about is putting together, for one, the structure needs to be very structured. It needs to be transparent. It needs to be accountable and rigorous. And I also liked your point, Mike. It has to be simple. You have to be able to see exactly what you're being asked to do. You can prove. It's got to be evidence. It's got to be auditable. And then the financial benefit associated with it. One of the things that I like to encourage my corporate clients to think about when they're putting some sort of structure to overcome this challenge of any sort of greenwashing or not being able to see that full transparency in the model is really to include some sort of ESG scorecard by a third party, right? Then you have an unbiased view. That data comes in, it's reported, and then it can be used to tie to a financial product. One associated program that I'll highlight that actually used that model was in the press a couple years ago was Bridgestone. They really wanted to tie their suppliers to environmental performance as well as a scorecard and scorecarding that. So when they rolled out their supply chain finance ESG program, they involved EcoVadis along with JP Morgan. So the suppliers were incented, one, through improving their environmental performance, but secondly, for having a scorecard with EcoVadis. So between the two, it was transparent, it was clear, we could tie it to the financial targets and evidence that. The fascinating part of that to me was the feedback from the suppliers once we rolled out that program, because the suppliers then had that scorecard. So their biggest incentive from a financial perspective was to be scorecarded, and then they received additional financial incentives as their ESG rating improved. But really, those suppliers were excited about being scorecarded because then you can use that data subsequent within your organization, maybe not just with Bridgestone, but others. So that is a challenge that we have in our industry, is really, one, making sure we future-proof these programs so that they're resilient over time. And the other challenge that Anne talked about is really within trade finance, there's not a lot of ESG standards today, right? We have LMA loans out there from a loan perspective. We have, within Europe, we do know the taxonomy is coming for environmentally valuable initiatives. We don't have that in trade finance yet, and that is a challenge. There's a lot of smart people working on that within the ICC, so I am confident we will evolve to there, but it's not going to be in the short term. So during that period of time, until we have those consistent standards, we as industry leaders, as organizations, as regulators really need to do those simple, transparent programs that are going to be future-proofed.
Thank you. Interesting. And if I may ask, how do you think organizations can be steered towards the required transformative journey? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and when I spoke in the beginning about our sustainability and social impact strategy, what I get really excited about this new 2025 strategy is that it's really embedded in our business growth strat plan. So taking that strategy and building it into your business strategic plan is core. And the governance, is really important too. So this comes all the way from our board down to our CEO, down to our senior level C-suite that really is standing behind this program and making sure we're committed to the long term. And really starting to think, to put it in financial context, about some new financial processes, some new ways to think about it. I'm working more closely than ever with our finance team, so it's helping to break down silos. And, just thinking about how do we value sustainability, both intangibly and tangibly? And how do we, even take into consideration some of the cost avoidances that are very important? So typically in our financial policies, we never make decisions based on avoidance. We always make it based on hard savings, right? That sound familiar? So, but I'm proud of the fact that our supply chain, and we measure this every year since we've been starting to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, has avoided over $700 million of energy costs during the time frame that we've measured it.
Very impressive.
So that's, that's important,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Absolutely.
Looking at the finance.
yeah.
So,
Absolutely, why not? Right.
so we're thinking new ways of measuring value of sustainability.
Yeah. There are quite a few questions that have come that people have put up here. Thank you so much to those of you who have sent these questions. Let me start asking these questions to pose these questions to our panelists. Interestingly enough, the first question literally says Coca-Cola, Colgate-Palmolive, Swatch. So 3 of you are there on the spotlight. You have made huge steps with ESG. What government legislation would you like to see introduced to help other businesses catch up? Can I request Ivan to just...
What other legislations?
What government legislation would you like to see introduced to help other businesses catch up?
Yeah, I mean, the one which was on votation in Switzerland, exactly this one, I think it was very good to have companies liable. We start to see now in the US, there was this big news lately of companies starting to be liable because of greenwashing accusations. And I think that the fact that that we start to have this liability of companies, I think it would be a very good step forward.
Exactly, exactly.
Definitely. Yes.
Actually, this point stuck in my mind, which is why I requested you for this question to answer this.
Yeah.
Any thoughts or comments from others? No. Okay.
Yeah. I think, that's a big question because it's a big world out there. Different governments need to focus on different things. But from a private sector standpoint, I think a company has to look at what's, let's say, material to us, what's important to us. And one of our biggest issues that we're tackling, that we're investing a lot of time, money, resources in, is eliminating plastic waste, because all our products take plastic, right? So, and I know Coca-Cola is equally focused in that space. So I think, Colgate doesn't traditionally engage in lobby with governments, but an important development that's underway right now is there's a UN talks underway to develop a plastic treaty globally that will hold governments actually liable for adhering to the standards.
Are you saying it's creating some kind of an ecosystem?
Well, yeah, definitely in this space, ecosystems with everybody working together is important. Even private sector to private sector, pre-competitive collaboration is key.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think, one of the things we came out a few years ago in favour of deposit return schemes, because it's all well and good your products being recyclable. It doesn't necessarily mean they are recycled.
Right. Exactly.
So, and generally, without some incentive, you improve, but you it's the law of diminishing returns. You get to a certain point and it's quite difficult to get above. Deposit return schemes really can increase that to sort of 90, 95, and higher percentage. And well-run schemes, sort of industry-wide schemes, are the best way to do that. But equally, they need to be, in partnership with government, and one that works for the whole. If it works for the whole infrastructure, then it will work and it will produce the right results. So.
Exactly. There's a very interesting question that has caught my eye. It says, how are you measuring returns on ESG investments? Has it increased the market share of consumers? Didn't quite get the second part, but the first part I would definitely like.
You answer that.
So how are you measuring returns on ESG investments?
Yeah, I think I think there's a point here that you have to be doing this stuff. It's a kind of in the future you won't be able to operate as a sort of multinational corporation without doing this. To what extent investors take it into account, I think depends on which country you're listed in. It depends on the makeup of your shareholders. It depends on, the long term or short term. I'm guessing that the majority of hedge fund investors are not. This is not high up on their agenda. So I think who knows whether it delivers returns from an investor perspective in terms of raising your share price, but certainly, doing more with less is generally a good business principle.
Yeah, absolutely agree. It's actually a diverse set of indicators that enable us to make those decisions. I have another interesting question on digital technologies and how they can help promote ESG across supply chain through data sharing and environmental reporting. So my question is, can blockchain-based finance solutions capture ESG? Heather, would you like to?
Sure. I mean, where I thought you were going with the technology initially is digitizing is the key to really getting to your smaller suppliers, right? Mm-hmm. And really getting them on board to all of these programs. So absolutely, I do think anything digital encompasses more suppliers, helps them get on board to the programs, absolutely. And blockchain can really be used for absolutely anything you want to tie to. So absolutely, blockchain can absolutely be pulled into the ESG arena to pull together, whether it be the reporting, the sharing of data, et cetera. So blockchain does it. I think the more and more we can go digital to reach out to those smaller suppliers. And then also to Anne's question earlier about challenges and incentives within the ESG world, and to what Mike said, I just want to comment on that as well, is that all the corporates are going to continue to get pressures on ESG. And it's going to come from a lot of areas. It's going to come from the government, like you talked about, and the regulators. That's coming in strong. It started in Europe, but if you can watch the US return to the Paris Accord, you've got China now setting standards. That's globally consistent. Anyone who's got consumers at the end of their supply chain, and Mike for sure, they're going to apply pressure from an ESG perspective. And then you do have the investors, which I definitely hear your words, some are more interested than the others, but they've certainly been focused on the E to date in terms of their investment. So I think all of those pressures are going to continue to put the corporates on a hot spot. And you're lucky, probably if you're in a corporate, that you're only impacted by one of those three factors. I think most people from a corporate perspective are likely impacted by about two of them.
So interesting. It's a set of factors that actually feed into the decision-making process.
Absolutely.
Let me pose the last and final question. And how is it you can turn, we've been discussing challenges, right? How is it we will turn challenges into opportunities for businesses? That's the last question. We have just 20 seconds. Mike.
There's a big question. I think there are huge opportunities here, and I think firstly it's the right thing to do. So, and I think corporations and the business world can be really proud of what it's doing in taking a lead in this area, and I think we should not lose sight of that. And I think if you recruit staff, if you talk to customers, if you talk to consumers, in all of those areas, there's huge advantages. In an inflationary world, if you can do things with less, as I say, doing the maximum you possibly can with finite resources has always been at the core of what business is about. And I think the ESG challenge we face is a theme on that.
This is a great way to actually end the panel by saying, yes, there's hope, there's something positive to look forward to. Thank you so much to all of you for such an interesting discussion. And let us also thank the audience, excellent questions, and the organizers. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.